I'm Jim Grismer, Professor and Dean Emeritus at the University of Denver. Welcome to Engaging Ideas, where we bring information and ideas from the Academy to the community to help think about real-world questions. Today's Engaging Idea looks at the changing nature of military power. In spite of the use and threat of use of military power by the United States, Russia, China, North Korea, and many others, there appears to be a great deal of debate in both the public and professional spheres about what one can reasonably expect to achieve with military power in the 21st century. It's an important question that has implications for our nation and for our individual security. Joining me at the Crimson Table is the director of the International Security Program at DU's Joseph Korbel School of International Studies. Dr. Griffith has a rich background studying the use of military force. Prior to joining the University of Denver, he was a faculty member at the United States Air Force Command and Staff College. He's the author of 10 publications and a frequent speaker on the use of military force. Hopefully, his ideas will spark your own thinking about this topic and encourage discussions with friends. So let's begin. So perhaps we could begin the discussion with kind of an overview of the current debate on the use of military force. What lies at the heart of this debate?
At the heart of this debate is the question about military efficacy. In a post-Cold War world where the world's most effective militaries, largest, most capable, most well-trained, have been very busy in a range of different kinds of environments and don't feel particularly satisfied with the outcomes they've been able to produce. There's a rethink, if you will, about whether what we think of as military power, what's referred to as the utility of force, is correct, is accurate, or is the foundations of what we believe to be military utility still accurate in the 21st century.
What's brought this to the fore?
Well, the primary mover, of course, is the United States. The world's largest and unsurpassed global military power has gone to Iraq and Afghanistan and perceived to struggle to achieve its objectives. But the debate also stems on Israel's actions against Hezbollah and Hamas, which they've not felt satisfied with NATO's efforts in Bosnia and Kosovo, that prior to the use of U.S. air power did not appear to be terribly successful. Russia's activities in the Ukraine. There's lots of things that are going on that don't look like war as we've traditionally understood it, but are clearly what militaries do on a daily basis.
So what's been the evolution of the discussion? Where's it come and gone?
Well, the anchor point for traditional understandings of military power actually stem from the 19th century tradition as written down largely by Karl von Clausewitz's unfinished but truly seminal work on war. And at least in the West, and certainly I would think in almost all major militaries, the starting point for the discussion has been a debate about Clausewitz and what Clausewitz captured from the Napoleonic era. Now, obviously, a lot has happened since the Napoleonic Wars, but most of military and strategic studies has been an evolutionary discussion about Clausewitz. The real debate now is whether that evolutionary period is resulted in something that is no longer helpful, and we need a true break from that academic and strategic studies tradition.
So tell me, to the extent that this rethinking process has begun, do we believe that the traditional views are still relevant?
Well, some do, and obviously, like any academic discipline, and strategic studies and military studies are to some degrees truly an academic discipline, the foundational argument has the advantage of a vast array of people who have been working on it for a very long time. It's elegant, it's explanatory, it's coherent, but it might be wrong. So what you simply have are traditionalists who argue that the problem is that the militaries of the world aren't applying what we know about military power appropriately. So it's a failure at a case-by-case basis of military and political leaders to do the right things. There's a new school of literature, what I'm going to call for simple purposes the new war phenomenon school, which argues no, What military and political leaders are doing is applying old principles and old expectations and telling their publics they're going to be able to do things that in the 21st century, militaries simply aren't going to be able to do. And so the failure is more systemic. It's not that you got Iraq or Afghanistan wrong, it's that you get how to use military power today wrong.
Tell me, what have we learned at this point that would move us toward a new understanding, perhaps new expectations on the use of military force?
Well, what we've learned basically is that in a globalized world, in a world in which almost all users of political violence have access to a vastly larger array of resources, of access points, etc., that the primary function of military power, which neither side of the debate argues, is to break adversary will. You want to use military force, you want to use the threat of force and simply violence itself to create a situation in which the adversary wants to make the political concessions you desire. Now, traditionalists argue that it's a two-step process, and Sir Michael Howard's famous piece, When Our War is Decisive, is the best short example of this, in which traditionalists argue you must first create a military victory that allows you to convince the adversary that they should not resist any further. And then what you should do is be generous in your political terms to resolve the conflict. It's a classic Clausewitzian kind of view. The new argument is that breaking of will through sheer force, that military defeat in the old-fashioned traditional sense, is unachievable. In a globalized world in which adversaries have access to media, or adversaries have access to resources from global networks, where a very small number of people can get a hold of a lot of destructive capability, and where wars are often about identity, this ability to break will seems very difficult to achieve to the new war or the critics of the traditional view.
Is this why the U.S. and its allies have had difficulties achieving sort of objectives in recent years?
Well, if I had a definitive answer to that, there wouldn't be a debate and we wouldn't be here. But it's certainly two sides of the argument. Let's take Afghanistan, for example, which I think is an easy one and has been in the news lately. President Trump's instincts were clearly to get out of Afghanistan as sort of an unwinnable war, at least candidate Trump's instincts were. But the U.S. military's position, and it's sort of a traditional take, is having done a great deal of work, much of it good, on behalf of Afghanistan. They don't want to be withdrawn now and turn lots of positive work and sunk costs into the appearance of a defeat, which is what they think Obama did in Iraq. The traditionalist response to this is that the compromise solution to send a very limited amount of American troops to do support and functionary roles is a mistake because you're not going to be able to break enemy will. You're not going to be able to win in Afghanistan with such a small footprint of American troops. The new war argument is, since you're not going to be able to break enemy will under any circumstances, that you're simply going to be there a great deal longer, and you should stop talking about winning in Afghanistan. The best you can do in Afghanistan is help Afghanis formulate some sort of new political solution. These are completely different interpretations of military power.
And does that apply, we saw in the Iraq War, for example, we've seen in attempting to influence the outcome in Syria. The same line of thinking applies in a general sense to that?
It does. The important point that the new war advocates make consistently, and I think somewhat accurately, is that in a world in which everyone can see what a war looks like, in a world in which political decisions about military power and how you're using it are made daily, potentially, where every individual soldier or drone or military prison guard can have a strategic impact, including fake reports about what they've actually done, it makes militaries in the West in particular, but I would argue in China and Russia and Japan as well, hesitant to take high-risk maneuvers, to include high-risk casualties, high risks of civilian casualties, high risks of collateral damage. This is a good thing from a moral and ethical standpoint. Certainly I'm not opposed to these concerns, but it will make the use of force to break enemy will that much more difficult. New war advocates say this is the new normal. You won't do the things you need to do to follow the traditional path because you can't, morally, ethically, economically, etc. So you should rethink how you understand and use military power. Traditionalists simply argue that this is a failure to understand what is required, and if you won't do what you need to do, you shouldn't be trying to do this at all.
Do we have any test cases that is tending to lead the thought one direction or the other?
Well, unfortunately, what we really have is a whole series of cases in which both sides are unhappy with the outcome. But I think the classic test case probably is, in fact, playing out in front of us. I think Afghanistan will turn out to be the case that defines how this goes. There's something called hybrid war that's being debated. In fact, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists just did a special issue for those that are interested. And Russia and the Ukraine is an example. A lot of people cite of how you successfully use military power in the 21st century, quasi-covertly, to achieve a very limited objective, which is really more about media and information and political disruption. But Syria is an interesting case because there's clearly no traditional answer to Syria. No one invaded Syria. No one particularly wants to intervene in Syria. So then the question becomes, what can military power achieve in what is fundamentally a political problem that is of low priority to most of the major powers?
So what are the implications of this emerging view in terms of international policy, international relations? How's that evolving?
Well, there could be enormous ramifications for one side of this debate or the other. If you in fact declare, as Rupert Smith did in his book, that war is dead, that what we think of as war is an entirely historical artifact, and the Syrias, Iraqs, Afghanistans, Ukraines are the more typical scenario, then you need to think how you employ militaries, how they're funded. Do they need to be as large as they are? Does the battle tank or the combat aircraft have a major role? And more importantly, you need to condition your audiences, the American people, NATO, etc., on what the expectations are. At the moment, people still expect to win America's wars, to use that very famous phrase. We may not be waging wars in which winning is a logical outcome. And that is not a conversation that certainly the general public has had. They may all be about stabilizing, or they may all be about assisting long-term political settlements. For example, the Cheney war advocates would argue extensively, you must negotiate with the Taliban. All parties in Afghanistan must be brought to the table, because the only solution is political, and the military peace can only support a comprehensive political settlement. This is certainly not the expectations most Americans had when we first went to Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11.
Well, this strikes me as the classic paradigm shift, a truly fundamental change of viewpoints in terms of a major and important question. Is this thought process occurring globally, or is it primarily in the United States and say, Western Europe?
No, it's a global phenomenon. The United States clearly has the largest, what you call, military studies community. The professional military education system in the United States is the largest in the world. There's lots of people like me working on these sorts of questions in the U.S. But actually, a lot of the best work has come from our allies, who are not wedded to a gigantic traditional military and can take a different perspective. From Canada, for example, the United Kingdom and Australia have all done some of the best sort of how do we balance these two forces out kinds of studies. But the Chinese are looking at this. Russia has clearly been studying this sort of thing and maybe putting into use, depending on your perspective. Israel has been working on this. I think it's clearly a global phenomenon. The question is, to one degree, if you have large-scale militaries and you're not going to use them on a large scale, how best do you rebalance all those costs and those investments and those missions to be more effective, at the same time not be wasteful? And I think everybody is wondering how to proceed and how likely the need for big military traditional war really is.
This is a fascinating question. And one of our objectives is to provide people with food for thought on important questions from the Academy to the public community. In terms of the key points you've made, in terms of questions, can you share a few questions that you might encourage people to think about, the general public, as they consider this and as they observe themselves world events? Some things they should think about.
The thing I would hope all Americans would get better at thinking about, and maybe all citizens of the globe should get better at thinking about, is what is the military objective? Because what this is really a debate about is what militaries might be able to actually achieve. And if you make the argument, which I think is quite true, that democracies are the primary entity challenged by this new phenomenon because they actually have to have public input into the public will to support or decline military operations. I think what we all need to think about is what is the balance between what we're trying to achieve and what we're willing to do to achieve it. If we are fighting wars, to use that term loosely, that we're not willing to do enough to win, we probably ought to have that conversation. And at the moment, most of the citizenry, to some degree all of us, are very dependent on what we know from the military about these decisions and situations. The American military is a very thoughtful, diverse entity. It's not a stereotype. It's not a monolith. But it does have strategic and military studies somewhat to itself in the United States, which means that an informed citizenry can actually pass judgment or at least participate better. And to be in defense of the military, maybe not overreact to situations that merit more staying the course. At the same time, maybe not overreact to situations that don't require military force. That would be the primary goal, would be a populace in my teaching, a populace that can evaluate these things on the terms in which the military and the political leadership think about them.
My thanks to Dr. Lewis Griffith for taking the time to share his ideas, research, and experience on the use of military force and the role of the military in the 21st century. To further your own thinking and encourage discussions with others on the use of military force in the 21st century, our website, du.edu/ideas, contains more information on this topic and our guest Lewis Griffith, as well as questions for group conversations. We invite you to take advantage of these resources provided by the University of Denver to support the public good and encourage thoughtful discussion on important topics. I hope you'll join us in the future as we bring more engaging ideas from the Academy to the community. I'm Jim Grismer. Thank you for watching.